Welcome to Workplace Violence Prevention. Learning objectives. Workplace violence is any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening disruptive behavior that occurs at the work site. It ranges from threats and verbal abuse to physical assaults and even homicide. It can affect and involve workers, clients, customers, and visitors. Many workers report having been victims of workplace violence each year, and acts of violence and other injuries are currently the third leading cause of fatal occupational injuries. However, it manifests itself. Workplace violence is a major concern for employers and workers nationwide. Unfortunately, many more cases go unreported. Research has identified factors that may increase the risk of violence for some workers at certain work sites. Such factors include exchanging money with the public and working with volatile, unstable people. Working alone or in isolated areas may also contribute to the potential for violence. Providing services and care and working where individuals are impaired by cannabis may also impact the likelihood of violence. Learning objectives. Workplace violence hazards. Workplace safety requirements. Workplace prevention program. Violence types. Worker rights and responsibilities. Employer responsibilities. Prevention program evaluation. Management commitment and worker involvement. Workplace safety analysis. Workplace security analysis. Engineering controls and adaptations. Workplace practice controls. Post-incident response. Record keeping and program evaluations. Lone worker safety. Robbery prevention methods. Workplace violence hazards. Workers in the cannabis industry are at increased risk of both severe and multiple incidents of violence. Small cannabis businesses may have limited resources for reducing the risk of robbery and other violent incidents, or for dealing with their effects. Income is lost when operations are disrupted, and resources might be spent on assessments, trauma recovery, etc. A violence prevention program gives more information about the effects violence may have on a workplace, employer responsibility, and the various stages of violence. In most workplaces where risk factors can be identified, the risk of assault can be prevented or minimized if employers take appropriate precautions. One of the best protections employers can offer their workers is to establish a zero-tolerance policy toward workplace violence. This policy should cover all workers, patients, clients, visitors, contractors, and anyone else who may come in contact with establishment personnel. Additionally, time of day and location of work, such as working late at night or in areas with high crime rates, are also risk factors that should be considered when addressing issues of workplace violence. Among those with higher risk are workers who exchange money with the public, delivery drivers, healthcare professionals, public service workers, customer service agents, law enforcement personnel, those who work alone or in small groups, and cannabis establishment workers. Workplace safety requirements. The United States Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, or CCOHS, and other government regulators require that workers have a right to a workplace free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Violence in the workplace increases the risk of severe stress among workers. In addition, workplace violence has been associated with a lack of quality sleep, depression, fatigue, insomnia, and post-traumatic stress disorder among workers. Exposure to violence should never be accepted as part of any job. By assessing their worksites in the cannabis industry, employers can identify methods for reducing the likelihood of incidents occurring. A well-written and implemented workplace violence prevention program, combined with engineering controls, administrative controls, and training, can reduce the incidence of workplace violence. This can be a separate workplace violence prevention program or can be incorporated into a safety and health program or worker manual of standard operating procedures, or SOPs. It is critical to ensure that all workers know the policy and understand that all claims of workplace violence will be investigated and remedied promptly. Employers are also encouraged to develop additional methods as necessary to protect workers in high-risk industries like the cannabis industry. Workers in the cannabis industry are at a higher risk of violence and homicide than most other industry sectors, since workers often involving sales in a retail dispensary environment are at a higher risk compared with workers in other types of licensed operations and the overall workforce. Workplace Prevention Program. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, recommends steps to prevent and reduce workplace violence incidents in licensed cannabis operations. NIOSH also encourages employers to implement and improve workplace violence prevention programs. These recommendations are based on a study of convenience stores that implemented elements of crime prevention through environmental design, or CPTED. You'll learn strategies to reduce the risk of injuries and deaths associated with robbery-related violence in the cannabis industry. Workplace factors. The following characteristics are associated with robbery and violence. Open late works, example 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. A history of robbery and other violent incidents. Limited visibility of the entrance or exit. No bullet-resistant shielding or security systems. No robbery prevention training for workers. Cash availability and independently owned or operated. Violence types. Workplace violence is violence or the threat of violence against workers. It can occur at or outside the workplace and ranges from threats and verbal abuse to physical assaults and homicide. Research identifies 4 types of workplace violence that are based on the perpetrator's relationship to the victims or the workplace. 1. Criminal intent. The perpetrator has no legitimate relationship with the business or its workers and is usually committing a crime along with violence. In these situations, active worker resistance to robbery is significantly associated with worker injury. 2. Customer or client. The perpetrator has a legitimate relationship with the business and becomes violent while being served by the business. 3. Worker on worker. The perpetrator is a worker or past worker of the business who attacks or threatens other workers or past workers in the workplace. 4. Personal relationship. The perpetrator usually does not have a relationship with the business, but has a personal relationship with the victim. Active shooter events are becoming more frequent, and in cannabis operations, workers may need to run, hide, or fight. Employers and workers should be aware that there are different responses needed for different scenarios. Prevention through design and NIOSH's hierarchy of controls to reduce the risk of violence can be considered in terms of prevention through design and the hierarchy of controls. In these models, design or engineering controls, which prevent cannabis workers from coming in contact with hazards, are considered more effective than practices or controls that require individual action by the worker. However, it shows itself, workplace violence is a growing concern for employers and workers. Contrary to popular opinion, sensational multiple homicides still represent a small number of workplace violence incidents. The majority of incidents are assaults, stalking, threats, harassment, and physical or emotional abuse that make no headlines in the news. Many of these incidents are not even reported to company officials or the police. Responding to workplace violence requires attention to more than just an actual physical attack. Any conduct that creates anxiety, fear, and a climate of distrust in the workplace is part of the workplace violence problem. Prevention programs that do not consider harassment in all its forms are unlikely to be effective. Worker rights and responsibilities. Workers have a right to a safe workplace. They have the right to expect a work environment that promotes safety from violence, threats, and harassment. They can actively contribute to preventive practices by doing the following: accept and adhere to an employer's preventive policies and practices. Become aware of and report violent or threatening behavior by coworkers or other warning signs. And follow procedures established by the Workplace Violence Prevention Program, including those for reporting incidents. The law requires employers to provide their workers with working conditions that are free of known dangers. The law also prohibits employers from retaliating against workers for exercising their rights under the law, including the right to raise a health and safety concern or report an injury. Employer responsibilities. Employers have a legal and ethical obligation to promote a work environment free from threats and violence. Cannabis employers can face economic loss from violence in lost work time, damaged worker morale and productivity, increased workers' compensation payments, medical expenses, and possible lawsuits and liability costs. Employers' roles in violence prevention can include adopting a workplace violence prevention program and communicating the policy to workers, providing regular training in preventive measures for all new and current workers, supervisors, and managers, supporting, not punishing, victims of workplace or domestic violence, adopting and practicing fair and consistent disciplinary procedures, fostering a climate of trust and respect among workers and between workers and management, and seeking help from threat assessment psychologists, social service agencies, law enforcement, and other outside sources when necessary. Employers can also offer protections, such as the following: provide safety education for workers so they know what conduct is not acceptable, what to do if they witness or are subjected to workplace violence, and how to protect themselves. Secure the workplace. Install video surveillance, extra lighting, and alarm systems, and minimize access by outsiders through identification badges, electronic keys, and guards. Provide safes to limit the amount of cash on hand, along with keeping a minimal amount of cash in registers during evenings and late-night hours. Equip cannabis delivery staff with cell phones and require them to prepare a daily work plan, and keep a contact person informed of their location throughout the day, along with keeping work vehicles properly maintained. Instruct workers not to enter any situation where they feel unsafe and introduce a buddy system or call the police for help in potentially dangerous situations. And develop procedures covering visits by medical cannabis patients, along with addressing the conduct of home visits, the presence of others in the home during visits, and the worker's right to refuse to provide services in a clearly hazardous situation. Preventive practices. Preventive measures can include pre-employment screening, identifying problem situations and risk factors, and security preparations. Identifying and screening out potentially violent people before hiring them is an obvious means of preventing workplace violence. Pre-employment screening practices must, however, be consistent with privacy protections and anti-discrimination laws. A thorough background check can be expensive and time-consuming. The depth of pre-employment scrutiny will vary according to the level and sensitivity of the job being filled and the policies and resources of the prospective employer. However, as an applicant is examined, the following can raise: a history of drug abuse, past conflicts, especially if violence was involved, with coworkers, past convictions for violent crimes, and a defensive, hostile attitude and a tendency to blame others for problems. Worker safety training. All cannabis workers must understand their establishment's policy, recognize situations that may become hostile, and know how to respond to them. Managers and supervisors should also know best practices for dealing with layoffs and terminations, worker discipline, and conflict resolution. Train workers and supervisors to detect out-of-bounds behavior or other warning signs, and how to report that behavior to managers. Training can also help educate workers on how to best respond to someone who seems troubled or potentially dangerous. It should include a clear statement to all workers on what to do if they see or become aware of a weapon. In almost all circumstances, leave the location and call for help. All training programs should be sensitive to cultural assumptions and stereotypes. Above all, they should emphasize focusing on an individual's manner, conduct, and behavior, rather than ethnic or group identity or social profile. Prevention program evaluation. As part of the overall program, employers should evaluate safety and security measures. Top management should regularly review the program and evaluate the program with each incident. Managers, supervisors, and workers should re-evaluate policies and procedures regularly to identify deficiencies and take corrective action. Management should share workplace violence prevention evaluation reports with all workers. Any changes in the program should be discussed at regular meetings of the Safety Committee, union representatives, or other worker groups. All reports should protect worker and patient confidentiality, either by presenting only aggregate data or by removing personal identifiers if individual data are used. Processes involved in an evaluation include: establish and train workers on a uniform violence reporting system, including a systematic review of all reports of all forms of violence, including near misses. Reviewing reports and minutes from staff meetings on safety and security issues. Analyzing trends and rates in illnesses, injuries, or fatalities caused by violence relative to initial or baseline rates. Measuring improvement based on lowering the frequency and severity of workplace violence. Keeping up-to-date records of administrative and work practice changes to prevent workplace violence to evaluate how well they work. Surveying workers before and after making job or worksite changes, or installing security measures or new systems to determine their effectiveness. Tracking recommendations through to completion. Keeping abreast of new strategies available to prevent and respond to violence in the cannabis industry as it develops. Surveying workers periodically to learn if they experience hostile situations in performing their jobs. Complying with OSHA and cannabis industry requirements for recording and reporting injuries, illnesses, and fatalities. And requesting periodic law enforcement or outside consultant review of the worksite for recommendations on improving worker safety. Several factors put cannabis industry workers at risk. These include the exchange of money, making them targets for robbery, solo work and isolated work sites, the sale of cannabis, poorly lit stores and parking areas, and lack of staff training in recognizing and managing escalating hostile and aggressive behavior. Violence Prevention Program Installation. Safety and Health Program Management Guidelines provide recommendations for workplace violence prevention programs in cannabis establishments. You learn how to build on those guidelines by identifying risk factors and describing some feasible solutions in the cannabis industry. Although not exhaustive, these workplace violence guidelines include policy recommendations and practical corrective methods to help prevent and mitigate the effects of workplace violence in cannabis operations. The program encourages employers to implement programs to identify the potential risks of workplace violence and to implement corrective measures. These recommendations are not a model program or a rigid package of violence prevention steps uniformly applicable to all establishments. No single strategy is appropriate for all businesses, since environmental and other risk factors for workplace violence differ widely among workplaces. Employers may use a combination of strategies suitable for cannabis operations. Employers are encouraged to develop a written program for workplace violence prevention. The extent to which the components of the program are in writing is less important than how effective the program is in practice. By implementing appropriate hazard prevention and control measures and ensuring management and worker involvement, employers will take the most critical steps in protecting their workplace from violent acts. A written statement of policy serves as a touchstone for the many separate plans, procedures, and actions required for an effective prevention program. In smaller cannabis establishments, a program can be effective without being documented. As the size of the workplace or the complexity of hazard control increases, written guidance becomes more important as a way to ensure clear communication and consistent application of policies and procedures. An employer could create a separate workplace violence prevention program or incorporate this information into an existing accident prevention program, worker handbook, or manual of standard operating procedures, or SOPs, for cannabis operations. These recommendations are not new standards or regulations and do not create any new duties, so these recommendations are not intended to establish a legal standard of care concerning workplace violence. Accordingly, these recommendations do not impose any new legal obligations or constraints on employers. Effective prevention programs. Violence prevention programs should set clear goals and objectives to prevent workplace violence. The goals and objectives must be suitable for the size and complexity of workplace operations. In addition, the program should be adaptable to different situations at the worksite. Whatever format the program takes, it is critical that employers clearly explain the prevention program to all workers. At a minimum, workplace violence prevention programs should establish a clear policy for workplace violence, verbal and nonverbal threats, and related actions. All personnel employed in the cannabis establishment should know the policy. Ensure that no worker who reports or experiences workplace violence faces reprisals. Encourage workers to promptly report incidents and suggest ways to reduce or eliminate risks. Require records of incidents to assess risk and measure progress. Outline a comprehensive plan for maintaining security in the workplace. The plan should include establishing a liaison with law enforcement representatives and others who can help identify ways to prevent and mitigate workplace violence. Assign responsibility and authority for the program to individuals or teams with appropriate training and skills. Ensure that adequate resources are available and that those responsible for the program develop expertise on workplace violence prevention in cannabis industry operations. And affirm management commitment to an environment that places as much importance on worker safety and health as on serving customers. The 4 components of an effective safety and health management system also apply to the prevention of workplace violence and are: 1. Management commitment and worker involvement. 2. Worksite analysis. 3. Hazard prevention and control. 4. Safety and health training. Management commitment and worker involvement. Management commitment and worker involvement are complementary and essential elements of an effective safety and health management system. To ensure an effective program, management and frontline workers must work together. If employers opt to use a team or committee approach to addressing this element, they must be careful to comply with the applicable provisions of the law. By obligating resources, both human capital and financial, management provides the motivation and ability to effectively address workplace violence. Management commitment should include demonstrating organizational concern for worker emotional and physical safety and health, which includes medical and psychological counseling and debriefing for personnel who experience or witness assaults and other violent incidents. Exhibiting an equal commitment to the safety and health of workers and store patrons. Assigning responsibility for the various aspects of the workplace violence prevention program to ensure that all managers, supervisors, and workers understand their obligations. Allocating appropriate authority and resources to all responsible parties. Maintaining a system of accountability for involved managers, supervisors, and workers. Supporting and implementing appropriate recommendations from safety and health committees. And working constructively with other parties, such as landlords, lessees, local police, and other public safety agencies to improve security in and around the worksite. Worker involvement. Worker involvement in violence prevention is especially critical in the cannabis industry. Frontline workers are often the most knowledgeable of business procedures and the business environment, especially in situations where no manager is present. Workers' experiences can help to identify practical solutions to safety challenges. The more inclusive the approach to developing a workplace violence prevention plan, the more comprehensive it will be. In addition, workers who are engaged in violence prevention programs are more likely to support them and ensure their effectiveness. Workers should be involved by contributing to the development of procedures that address safety and security concerns, including responding to surveys on these issues. Understanding and complying with the workplace violence prevention program and safety and security measures. Reporting violent incidents promptly and accurately. Participating in safety and health committees or teams that receive reports of violent incidents or security problems. Make facility inspections and respond with recommendations for corrective strategies. And taking part in training programs and sharing on-the-job experiences that cover techniques to recognize escalating agitation, aggressive behavior, or criminal intent. Workplace safety analysis. Worksite analysis involves a step-by-step assessment to identify environmental and operational risks for violence. The analysis entails reviewing specific procedures or operations that contribute to hazards, identifying areas where hazards may develop, and performing periodic safety audits. Since the hazard analysis is the foundation for the violence prevention program, it is important for the employer to carefully consider the persons or team that will conduct the analysis. If a team is used, it should include representatives from senior management, operations, workers, security, occupational safety and health personnel, and legal and human resources staff. A small business may only need to assign the duty to a single worker or consultant. The recommended program for worksite analysis includes, but is not limited to, analyzing and tracking records, conducting screening surveys, and analyzing workplace security. Records review and analysis. To begin a hazard analysis, an employer should review previous operation practices and records for at least 2 or 3 years. The employer should collect and examine any medical, safety, workers' compensation, and insurance records to identify any incidents of workplace violence. The review should include a log of work-related injuries and illnesses if the employer is required to maintain one. In addition, worker and police reports of incidents or near incidents of assault or aggressive behavior should be examined to identify and analyze trends in assaults relative to particular job titles, workstations, and date and time. Through this analysis, an employer can identify the frequency and severity of incidents to establish a baseline for measuring improvement. Employers with more than one establishment or facility may review each location's history of violence. To learn about trends in the community or industry, an employer may contact local businesses, trade associations, police departments, and community and civic groups. An employer should use several years of data, if possible, to gain a clear understanding of the existing trends. Conducting screening surveys. Finding a few documented cases of workplace violence should not be dismissed as random, because incidents may go unreported or undocumented. Management may not be aware of low-intensity incidents or threats of violence that workers experienced. The worker questionnaire or survey about workplace violence issues can identify if customers have assaulted workers, if the business has had to address other crimes, such as shoplifting, if workers have been threatened or harassed while on duty, whether firearms were carried and or used, how many workers were on duty when any incidents occurred, whether the police were called, what workers were doing before and during the incident, whether preventive measures were in place at the time of the incident and whether they were implemented, where incidents occurred, and how often these incidents occurred. Employers may also use surveys to solicit workers' ideas on the potential for violent incidents and to identify or confirm the need for improved security measures. Detailed baseline screening surveys can help pinpoint tasks that put workers at risk. Periodic surveys, conducted at least annually or when business operations change or workplace violence incidents occur, can help employers identify new or previously unnoticed risk factors in work practices, procedures, or controls. After these reviews, employers should provide feedback and follow up with their workers. Employers may choose to use independent reviewers to conduct and analyze these surveys. Independent reviewers, such as safety and health professionals, law enforcement, security specialists, and insurance safety auditors, may offer advice to strengthen programs. These experts can also provide fresh perspectives to improve a violence prevention program. Workplace security analysis. Employers should have the designated team, worker, or consultant periodically inspect the worksite and evaluate job tasks to identify hazards, conditions, operations, and situations that could expose workers to violence. An initial walkthrough survey should be conducted to identify risks and establish a baseline, so to find areas requiring further evaluation, the team or coordinator should analyze incidents, including the characteristics of assailants and victims. Incident descriptions should include an account of what happened before and during the incident, and the relevant details of the situation and its outcome. When possible, someone should obtain police reports and recommendations. Identify jobs or locations with the greatest risk of violence, as well as processes and procedures that put workers at risk of assault. The analysis should include an estimate of the frequency and time when the risk of violence is greatest. Note high-risk factors, such as types of cannabis dispensary patrons, or environmental factors, such as building layouts, interior and exterior lighting, communication systems, such as telephones, and where security systems are installed. And evaluate the effectiveness of existing security measures, including engineering controls. Analysis should include whether or not security measures are being implemented, and whether or not they reduce or eliminate risk factors. If security measures are not being implemented, the analysis should determine what has inhibited their use. By effectively preventing and controlling workplace violence hazards, employers are better able to protect workers and avoid workplace incidents. After hazards are identified through the systematic worksite analysis, employers will need to take steps to prevent or control those hazards. Employers or someone they designate should develop measures that include engineering, procedural, and administrative changes to reduce or eliminate the likelihood of violent incidents. Employers will likely need to use a combination of controls to manage the hazards identified through their hazard analyses, but should carefully assess the effectiveness of each type of approach. Engineering controls and adaptations. Engineering controls remove the hazard from the workplace or create a barrier between the worker and the hazard. Engineering controls are considered the most effective because they make physical improvements without any dependence on human behavior. If a given situation does not allow for engineering controls, employers should next consider procedural and administrative changes. Once prevention and control measures are in place, employers should ensure that procedures are followed and that workers are supported. Given that cannabis operations are prone to robberies, employers should seek to reduce their risk by improving visibility and surveillance, controlling customers' access, and limiting the availability of cash. Such measures could include limiting window signs to low or high locations and keeping shelving low so that workers can see incoming customers, and so that law enforcement can also observe what is occurring from the outside of the store. Ensuring the customer service and cash register areas are visible from outside the establishment. Placing curved mirrors at hallway intersections or concealed areas. Maintaining adequate lighting inside and outside the establishment. Installing video surveillance equipment and closed-circuit TV to increase the likelihood of identification of perpetrators. Using door detectors so that workers are alerted when someone enters the store. Having height markers on exit doors to help witnesses provide more accurate descriptions of assailants. Installing and regularly maintaining alarm systems and other security devices, panic buttons, handheld alarms, or noise devices cellular phones, and private channel radios where risk is apparent or may be anticipated. Arranging for a reliable response system when an alarm is triggered. Installing fences and other structures to direct the flow of customer traffic into and around the store. Controlling access to the store with door entry, buzzer systems. Installing physical barriers such as bullet-resistant enclosures with pass-through windows between customers and workers. And using safes to limit the availability of cash to cashiers and posting signs that state that cashiers have limited access to cash. Workplace practice controls. Administrative and work practice controls affect the way workers perform their jobs or specific tasks. Changes in work practices and administrative procedures can help prevent violent incidents. Often policies are needed to ensure that the engineering controls are implemented and used effectively. For example, employers should integrate violence prevention activities into daily procedures, such as checking lighting, locks, and security cameras to help maintain a secure worksite. Require workers to use the drop safes and keep a minimal amount of cash in each register. Develop and implement procedures for the correct use of physical barriers, such as enclosures and pass-through windows. Establish a policy of when doors should be locked. Require workers to keep doors locked before and after official business hours. Require workers to lock doors used for deliveries and garbage removal when not in use. In addition, require that deliveries be made during normal daytime operations. And develop and implement emergency procedures for workers to use in case of a robbery or security breach, such as calling the police or triggering an alarm. Other administrative and work practice controls, independent of engineering controls, include cash levels should be kept as low as practical and workers should not carry business receipts on their persons unless it is necessary. When possible, increase staffing levels at stores with a history of robbery or assaults, or located in high-crime areas, so use the buddy system, especially when personal safety may be threatened. Establish rules and practices to ensure that workers can walk to garbage areas and outdoor storage areas without increasing their risk of assault. Establish liaisons with local police to report all incidents of violence and give police physical layouts of facilities to expedite investigations. Require workers to report all assaults or threats to a supervisor or manager, for example, through a confidential interview. Keep logbooks and reports of such incidents to help determine any necessary actions to prevent recurrences, and advise workers of company procedures for requesting police assistance or filing charges when assaulted if necessary. Provide management support during emergencies. Respond promptly to all complaints. Set up a trained response team to respond to emergencies. Use properly trained security officers to deal with aggressive behavior. Follow written security procedures. Discourage workers from wearing necklaces or chains to help prevent possible strangulation in confrontational situations. And provide staff members with security escorts to parking areas in the evening or late hours. Ensure that parking areas are highly visible, well-lit, and safely accessible to the building. Administrative controls work only if they are followed. Employers should monitor workers regularly to ensure proper work practices are used. Employers should also provide periodic constructive feedback to workers to ensure that they understand and appreciate the importance of these procedures. Post-incident response. Post-incident responses and evaluations are essential for an effective violence prevention program. Policies should include standard operating procedures, or SOPs, for management and workers to follow in the aftermath of a violent incident. Response procedures should ensure that the incident is properly investigated, workers receive the appropriate attention, and, in the event of injury, injured workers receive prompt and appropriate medical treatment. Such procedures may include the following: providing prompt first aid and emergency medical treatment for injured workers, which may include transportation to the local emergency medical facility. Reporting incidents to the police or notifying other authorities as required by applicable laws and regulations. Securing the premises to safeguard evidence and reduce distractions during the post-incident response process, so that police or authorities may investigate properly. And preparing an incident report immediately after the incident, noting details that might be forgotten over time. Informing management about the incident. Victims of workplace violence suffer a variety of consequences, in addition to their actual physical injuries, so these may include short- and long-term psychological trauma, fear of returning to work, changes in relationships with coworkers and family, feelings of incompetence, guilt, and powerlessness, and fear of criticism by supervisors or managers. Consequently, a strong follow-up program for these workers will not only help them to deal with these problems, but also help prepare them to confront or prevent future incidents of violence. Several types of assistance can be incorporated into the post-incident response. For example, trauma crisis counseling, critical incident stress debriefing, or worker assistance programs may be provided to assist victims. Certified worker assistance professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, clinical nurse specialists, or social workers may provide this counseling, or the employer may refer workers to an outside specialist. In addition, the employer may establish a worker counseling service, peer counseling, or support groups. Counselors should be well-trained and have a good understanding of the issues and consequences of assaults and other aggressive, violent behavior. Appropriate and promptly rendered post-incident debriefings and counseling reduce acute psychological trauma and general stress levels among victims and witnesses. In addition, this type of counseling educates staff about workplace violence and positively influences workplace and organizational cultural norms to reduce the trauma associated with future incidents. Safety and health training. Training and education ensure that all staff members are aware of potential security hazards and how to protect themselves and their coworkers through established policies and procedures. Workers with different jobs and responsibilities may need different types and levels of training. Every worker, including supervisors and managers, should understand the concept of universal precautions for violence, which refers to the concept that violence should be expected but can be avoided or mitigated through proper precautionary preparation. Workers need to know the specific hazards associated with their jobs and worksite to help them minimize their risk of assault and injury. Training should include information on worksite-specific potential hazards and instructions on how to control those hazards. Training should also include guidance to limit workers from intervening in workplace altercations whenever possible, unless enough staff or emergency response teams and security personnel are available. Topics may include the following: an overview of the potential risk of assault, the workplace violence prevention policy, operational procedures, such as cash handling rules, are designed to reduce risk. Proper use of security measures and engineering controls designed to reduce risk. early recognition of escalating behavior or recognition of warning signs of situations that may lead to assaults. Behavioral strategies, such as conflict resolution and aggression management techniques, to diffuse tense situations and reduce the likelihood of a violent outcome. The location and operation of safety devices, such as alarm systems, along with required maintenance schedules and procedures. Policies and procedures for reporting the incident to the proper authorities, as well as record keeping. Policies and procedures for obtaining medical care, counseling, workers' compensation, or legal assistance after a violent episode or injury. Specific instructions on how to respond to a robbery, such as turning over money or valuables without resistance, and how to respond to attempted shoplifting. And emergency action procedures are to be followed in the event of a robbery or violent incident. Qualified trainers should provide instruction at the comprehension level appropriate for workers. Effective training programs involve role-playing, simulations, and drills. At a minimum, employers should provide the required training annually. Workers who forget safety measures should be retrained. New, reassigned, temporary, and visiting workers should receive the same training as permanent staff. In addition, cannabis establishments with high worker turnover may need to provide training more frequently. The training program should also include an evaluation. At least annually, the team or coordinator responsible for the program should review its content, methods, and frequency of training. Program evaluations may involve supervisor and worker interviews, testing, observing, and reviewing reports of the behavior of individuals in threatening situations. Supervisors and managers need to recognize high-risk situations so they can ensure that workers are not placed in assignments that compromise their safety. Following training, supervisors and managers should be able to recognize a potentially hazardous situation and make any necessary changes in the physical worksite and/or policies and procedures to reduce or eliminate hazards. They should also be able to handle traumatized workers. Security personnel need specific training relating to the worksite, including the psychological components of handling aggressive and abusive store patrons, and ways to handle aggression and diffuse hostile situations. Record keeping and program evaluations. Record keeping and evaluations of the violence prevention program are necessary to determine its overall effectiveness and identify any deficiencies. Record keeping is essential to the program's success. Good records help employers determine the severity of the problem, evaluate methods of hazard control, and identify training needs. Records can be especially useful to large organizations and members of a business group or trade association who pool data. Through trend analysis, records of injuries, illnesses, accidents, assaults, hazards, corrective actions, histories, and training can help identify problems and solutions for an effective program. Employers can tailor their record-keeping practices to the needs of their violence prevention program. Maintaining records enables employers to monitor ongoing efforts to deter workplace violence, determine if a violence prevention program is working, and identify ways to improve it. Important records employers may maintain include log work-related injuries and illnesses, so employers who are required to keep this log must record any new work-related injury that results in death, days away from work, days of restriction or job transfer, medical treatment beyond first aid, loss of consciousness, or a significant injury diagnosed by a licensed healthcare professional. Injuries caused by assaults must be entered on the log if they meet the recording criteria. Medical reports of work injury and supervisor's reports for each recorded assault. These records should describe the type of assault, such as an unprovoked sudden attack or patron-to-patron altercation, who was assaulted, and all other circumstances of the incident. The record should include a description of the environment or location, potential or actual cost, lost work time that resulted, and the nature of injuries sustained. These medical records are confidential documents and should be kept in a locked location under the direct responsibility of a supervisor or a head officer. Records of incidents of abuse, verbal attacks, or aggressive behavior that may be threatening, such as pushing or shouting and acts of aggression toward other clients. These records may be kept as part of an incident report. Employers should ensure that the affected department evaluates these records routinely. Documentation of minutes of safety meetings, records of hazard analyses, and corrective actions recommended and taken. And records of all training programs, attendees, and qualifications of trainers. Lone worker safety. The cannabis industry currently employs lone workers in nearly every stage of its operations. This number will grow as its workforce expands. Lone workers, workers who work on their own in their place of employment, have additional risks by nature of their isolation. In high-tech facilities, plants are grown in a tissue culture lab by lone technicians who are tasked with micropropagation. In highly automated facilities, lone workers usually perform oil extraction and seed processing. This involves lone workers being by themselves on the facility floor as they oversee the process and ensure it is running smoothly. In smaller-scale factories or small independent farms, crops are frequently tended and harvested by lone workers. Due to the presence of large quantities of cash and product, lone workers in the cannabis industry are also at increased risk of violence. Workplace violence can take many forms, including verbal threats, threatening behavior, and physical assault, and can be committed by strangers, customers, coworkers, or personal relations. The most obvious opportunity for violence in the industry is at a cannabis cultivation facility or retail dispensary store. The high-stress environment and the threat of disgruntled former workers have the potential to elevate the associated risks. In addition, other routine activities, like moving large quantities of products between stores or transporting products in personal vehicles, also create opportunities for a violent offender to attempt a robbery. As they continue to expand, cannabis cultivation operations and retail cannabis dispensaries need to evaluate options to secure and monitor the safety of all workers, including lone workers. To adequately protect lone workers, cannabis businesses should develop lone worker safety policies. Such a policy would communicate the risks presented when a worker works alone, define everyone's responsibilities, and describe the actions required to minimize those risks. There are 3 key factors to determine the risks associated with lone workers. 1. The first is the environment. Businesses need to consider the area in which workers perform their jobs, so this can include working in high-crime jurisdictions or handling dangerous chemicals. 2. Next, they have to identify the tasks that lone workers do that might put them in harm's way. Transporting products between stores or closing a location late at night are just examples of high-risk tasks. 3. Finally, businesses have to consider the people with whom lone workers interact. Are they likely to be intoxicated or aggressive, and how might these conditions increase the risk for a lone worker? Worker responsibilities. Once the risks have been identified, it is important to list a worker's responsibilities in each situation and describe all required actions. The policy should define the standard operating procedures, or SOPs, and cover the training required to help workers develop the understanding and skills needed to do their jobs safely. SOPs for a lone worker in a cannabis retail setting could include the following. Wear a company-provided safety device. Make sure the lights are working. Make sure the cameras are properly focused and have the right line of sight. And do not take the trash out after 5 p.m. The associated training would ensure that workers understand their roles, the risks they face, and how to manage difficult situations involving aggressive customers, being followed, and dealing with known troublemakers. Training could also cover conflict resolution and anxiety management, including how to assess a potentially dangerous situation, how to recognize signs of aggression, and how to communicate effectively to diffuse conflict. Most importantly, the policy should include both a synopsis of the security technologies in place to help lone workers, as well as a detailed emergency communications plan that all workers must follow should they feel threatened or at risk. Safety monitoring technology. Choosing the right portable security device is a critical part of any lone worker safety policy in the cannabis industry. These personal safety monitoring devices are always on, including a single push panic button that silently dispatches security and can connect with a live monitoring service in seconds. They can also be directly integrated with interactive 24/7 command centers. This provides lone workers with access to experienced security professionals at the touch of a button. The device should be small, lightweight, and unobtrusive. It should require no installation or configuration by the end user, and should also be robust enough that workers will want to use it. There is a new breed of smart, wearable, and discreet personal protection devices that are designed to meet these criteria. They can be worn on a lanyard, belt, vest, jacket, or pants, and provide a cost-effective option for cannabis businesses that want to protect their lone workers. And because the devices are cellular-based, there is no limit to how far a worker can be from their place of business. This is a real asset for use cases involving cash deposits or cash transfers. All of these features can boost morale and give lone workers confidence when doing their jobs because they know they don't have to take unnecessary risks. Wearable solutions have recently been launched that directly integrate with interactive 24/7 central command centers. These solutions offer single-push access to two-way voice communications, user profile data, near real-time images, and geolocation data. This means that trained security professionals can immediately assess a situation, intervene, and deploy the appropriate emergency response. With more camera eyes and ears on the ground, the opportunity to de-escalate a situation increases. These personal protection solutions play a critical role in offering better safety to lone and mobile workers as well as customers. And as the industry continues to grow and expand its workforce, it is clear that personal protection devices and lone worker monitoring solutions should be an essential part of any comprehensive business security strategy. Robbery prevention methods. Building managers, employers, and workers in the cannabis industry implement measures to reduce the risk of robbery and violence in their licensed operations. A comprehensive approach, implementing as many measures as possible, so building managers can incorporate the following elements into their operations: active, working alarm systems connected to the local police department; entrance or exit doors that are easily seen by store workers for monitoring and may also serve as escape routes for workers; Exit routes that are accessible and unobstructed by inventory, boxes, etc. Doors with fully functioning locks and a policy about when to lock doors. Unobstructed windows, not blocked by signs or objects, that allow law enforcement to see in from the outside. Bulletproof barriers where payments are made to provide additional protection for workers. Trespassing affidavits, agreements allowing police departments to order trespassers to leave the property, even in the absence of the store representative. Active, recording surveillance cameras with no blind spots. Curved mirrors cover a wider area in the reflection. In-store shelving that is not high enough to be a hiding place for perpetrators. And a safe area for workers to go if they feel they are in danger. Example, a hidden room that locks from the inside, has a second exit route, and has a phone or silent alarm. Employers can take the following steps. Post signs indicating that workers do not have access to the safe. Reduce available cash on the premises and ensure that workers make deposits frequently so time lock safes cannot be opened until specified times. Do not allow signage, advertisements, promotions, stickers, or writing on facility windows. These items obstruct the view into the facility for responding law enforcement officers. Provide workers with options to minimize contact with customers. Ensure that work areas and money, inventory, storage, etc. locations are restricted to workers only, and ensure emergency exit routes, including exits workers rarely use, are not blocked or obstructed by inventory, pallet jacks, etc. In the event of an active shooter, these exit routes may be used by customers and workers for survival. Provide training to workers about the following. Steps to take in the event of a robbery, including not resisting when the situation is robbery only. And steps to take in the event of an active shooter, including locations of safe zones, exit routes not routinely used, and emergency numbers. Workers can take the following steps. If you are in a situation that feels unsafe, remove yourself from the situation if possible. Call the police for help. And know the location of all exits, alarms, emergency numbers, call buttons, and other emergency information. Be alert. Evaluate each situation for potential violence when you enter a room or begin to interact with a customer or visitor. Be aware of anyone who shows signs of possible violence. Report any violent or potentially violent situations to your manager and local law enforcement. And report any person who appears to be casing the store, loitering for long periods, or stalking you or another worker. Watch for signals that may be associated with impending violence. Verbally expressed anger and frustration. Body language such as threatening gestures, signs of impairment from drug or cannabis use, and brandishing a weapon or firearm. Maintain behavior that does not escalate anger. Don't match threats. Don't shout commands or give orders to a potentially violent person. And do not resist a situation that involves only robbery. Avoid any behavior that may be interpreted as aggressive, for example, getting too close to a potentially violent person or speaking loudly. Thank you for viewing Workplace Violence Prevention.